We all remember the Arab Spring, which happened a little over 10 years ago. It started in Tunisia, but really it was supercharged when an Egyptian street vendor burned himself alive to protest police corruption. The protests spread, the US was sort of involved, and by 2012 there were new rulers in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen. There were protests that had rocked a dozen more countries and really kind of changed the politics of the Middle East. It was hopeful, it was tragic. It was also cynical all at once. And the war in Syria that came out of it is still going on today. So it was, a lot of optimism at the start, but a pretty ugly ending, and really quite disastrous, in fact. Now, the Arab Spring had a lot of causes. There was, there's like an angry new generation. It's basic stuff we understand, like people wanted a more responsive politics, frustration with corruption. But one, I think, really important factor often goes unmentioned, which is food, and in particular, food prices. So in the second half of 2010, global food prices increased by about a third, and there were a lot of reasons for this. So in food-producing countries, there were a bunch of problems, like there were fires in Russia, heavy rains in Canada, Australia had floods, Argentina had a drought, and all of these things drove down crop yields, which in turn drove up food prices, including food prices across the Middle East. The consequence was the Arab Spring. Food matters. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Food prices, the geopolitics of food, and the food business. I'm Matt Stoller. This is another big breakdown. Now, I want to start with a quote from Lester Brown, who's the president of a think tank called the Earth Policy Institute. If you want to predict where political instability, revolution, coup d'etat, or interstate warfare will occur, the best factor to keep an eye on is not GDP, the Human Development Index, or energy prices. If I were to pick a single indicator, economic, political, social, that I think will tell us more than any other, it would be the price of grain. He's an old white guy, so you should listen to him. Seems very authoritative, right? Actually, if you want someone more authoritative, you can pick Henry Kissinger. Now, that guy was super cynical, and he actually knows how to wield power in a pretty brutal way. My theory is actually that he's immortal, but he, was an enormously powerful, influential guy in the American and global foreign policy establishment. And he said that, or is reported to have said, that if you want to know how to run a country, or run a region, to wield geopolitical power, let me just give you the quote. Quote, if you control food, you control the people. So that's Henry Kissinger. When people don't have food, they riot, and governments fall. I mean, we've noticed that Biden's polling ain't doing too well, and that's with just slightly higher prices for food and gasoline. Most countries produce enough calories to feed their population, but some are actually reliant on imports. So it's not always just prices, sometimes there's a deficit. Now, the largest wheat importers, and wheat, of course, is, bread, right? Makes bread. These are Egypt, Indonesia, Turkey, China, Algeria, Bangladesh, Iran. These are big, important countries. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. China is the world's factory, and Iran has a lot of oil and is in a very important geographic position, and it has the ability to basically shut down oil flows from the Middle East if things get really bad. Now, food riots in these countries can be pretty dangerous, and that's, of course, not to speak of the suffering that will go on when people go hungry globally, especially in poorer countries. So with that, let's talk about the war in Russia and Ukraine. And that war has driven wheat prices to a record high. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. The European Union gets over half of its corn imports, around a fifth of its wheat imports, and almost a quarter of its vegetable oil imports from Ukraine. Vegetable oil goes into lots of processed foods, so it's pretty important. Ukraine and Russia account for about 30% of the world's traded wheat. Now, that's not all the wheat in the world. A lot of countries grow wheat domestically, and then they consume it domestically. But some wheat is traded for countries that have a net calorie deficit in terms of what they produce. That is traded wheat. And that traded wheat has been taken off the market. Now, it's not just that sanctions and war are stopping the purchase of these crops. It's also that ships just can't move the crops with a war on. The ports are closed. People are shooting at ships. It's a problem. Now, aside from wheat, Ukraine is a key exporter of all sorts of grains, like and basic foodstuffs like corn, sunflower oil, barley. And Russia is a significant producer of inputs to food, fertilizers like potash, as well as natural gas, which is a large input for nitrogen fertilizers. Producing fertilizers is almost like refining natural gas. Now, the U.S., for example, we import about a fifth of our nitrogen fertilizers and 11% of our potash fertilizers from Russia and Belarus. And Belarus is an ally of Russia. It recently announced that it won't be exporting potash for now, thank you very much. There are alternative sources of supply for food and for these fertilizers for countries that import it. Russia and Ukraine aren't the only exporters of grain. It's 30% of traded wheat, but there are others. There is the US, Canada, Argentina, Australia, India, Brazil. They all grow a lot of wheat, as does China, though China is actually a net importer. But across the world in a bunch of these grain-growing regions, there are problems. Everyone's dealing with high fertilizer and energy costs. Obviously, Russia and Ukraine are in a war. Argentina is in a severe drought, which causes problems both for growing crops, but also transporting them through rivers. Canada is recovering from a drought, and it's tight on reserves. There's dry conditions in Kansas, which is sort of the important wheat-growing region in the US. And this is not a headline that you want to see right now. China is having trouble with its winter wheat production. And you don't want to see news like this either. Basically, we're headed for high food prices and potentially even shortages. But all is not lost. China, for example, has stockpiled 150 million tons of wheat, which is about half of the global reserve. And that's enough for 18 months of demand, or to satisfy 18 months of demand. Now, to give you a frame of reference, because these are just big numbers, and if you're not in agriculture, they seem sort of random. But the USDA projects that the war will only take 4 million tons of Ukrainian wheat off the market. So, that's 180. There's 281 million tons of global reserves. China has about half of them. So the Chinese could actually distribute some of that reserve if there is a famine. And other countries have reserves as well. We have reserves. Canada has reserves. Also, let's not forget about this, and this is probably the most important part of the story. Other nations, including the US, can actually put more land under the plow to grow more grain. The US, we're a big exporter of grains, the number 2 exporter of wheat after Russia. And we can put a lot more land under cultivation if we want to do that. But it's not clear that that's happening. First of all, the winter wheat plantings are largely done. Winter's over. But more importantly, farmers are beset with high costs. And so they know when they plant that they have to pay for a bunch of stuff. But, a season takes a while. And though prices might be high now, they don't know how long those high prices will last. The war could end tomorrow, and prices could tumble. So to really increase land under cultivation, we'd have to take on some key challenges. We'd have to fix this financial problem. And notably, we'd have to address the reason that farmers have trouble making money these days by farming and growing food. And that is something that I think a lot about, which is corporate consolidation. Over the last 40 years, American farmers have been just killed by the roll-up of power in the American economy. So to give a quick stat, and this is kind of a broad stat about, that encompasses everything from Uber to peanut butter to food to technology. So this isn't just agriculture, but 75% of industries have gotten more concentrated just in the last 20 years. Corporate markups, which is the amount of money that firms make when they're above cost, have gone from about 20% to 60% from the 1980s to today. And this is largely concentrated in large businesses with market power. So it's not a function of technology or anything like that. It's small businesses and labor have been suffering, and small businesses include farmers. So the consolidation crisis is as bad in agriculture as it is anywhere else. So for example, Iowa's lost almost a third of its farms since the late 1970s. Missouri had 23,000 independent pig farmers in 1985. It has just a few thousand today, if that. Broadly speaking, in 1990, smaller farms accounted for about half of all agricultural production. Now it's less than a quarter, and smaller farms, they can be a little more flexible. They can put more land under cultivation and pretty quickly. The basic problem is that the profit that used to go to the farmer for growing food now goes to the middleman corporation that manipulates the farmer. So to give you some stats on how consolidated this whole space is, and I'm not even getting to the retail sector, which, supermarket consolidation is out of control, and that kind of sits on top of everything. But 4 corporations supply 75% of the nitrogen fertilizer in the United States. 2 corporations supply all of North America's potash, which is the potassium-based fertilizer that you also need for growing crops. So the number of fertilizer producers in the US has dropped from about 46 to 13 since the 1980s. 4 chemical firms control 60% of the world's seeds. This used to be like Monsanto, but Monsanto got bought by Bayer. And there's just been tremendous roll-ups of power in that space too. 4 grain trading firms, this is Cargill and ADM and firms like that, control about 90% of grains. These dominant corporations are, of course, immensely profitable, and they are doing really well. ADM stock, for example, just to pick one, and I like ADM because they were caught for price fixing years ago, and they actually made a movie with Matt Damon on it. Not that great a movie, but people know of ADM for that reason. Archer's Daniel Midland. So ADM stock has gone up by about 20% this year alone, and that's largely because of the war in Ukraine, which is about a $10 billion increase in value. Agribusiness giants make money by selling to farmers, or they make money by buying from farmers, or both. So basically, farmers are surrounded on all sides by firms with market power. Whether farmers are trying to buy seeds, chemicals, herbicides, fuel, fertilizer, or farm equipment, or whether they're trying to sell wheat, barley, cattle, pigs, other types of commodities. Now, it's true that the price of what farmers are selling is going up, but is it going up enough to cover the cost of what it takes to actually produce these crops or animals? Or are the monopolies in the middle taking all the profit margin that should have gone to the farmer? I'm going to put my money on the monopolists because they have a lot more information about the market and they have a lot more bargaining power. So with high costs for what it takes to produce crops, it's hard to make it, even with higher prices. The middleman with market power is taking all the margin. Now, farmers are responding in a number of ways. Some are experimenting with ways of producing crops that use less fertilizer. Like there's something called precision agriculture, which involves taking very detailed maps of their farms and very specific ways of applying chemicals. Of course, this relies on buying data from dominant firms as well. So there's monopoly or market power involved here. And farmers are increasingly trying to grow cover crops. These are plants that maintain fertility in the soil. They can kind of be a little bit of a substitute for using lots of fertilizers. And but the thing is these sort of stopgaps probably won't be enough. We have, like it or not, an industrial food system. And you just need fertilizer and pesticides to grow the food that we need. And it's really expensive to buy the inputs to do that right now. The net effect is that some farmers are losing money, even at the extremely high prices they are getting for their crops. And that's a problem. High prices should be a signal to produce more. And if you're losing money despite high prices, you're not necessarily going to produce more even when we need it. So the Department of Agriculture expects farm income to drop 7.9% this year. That's down $9.7 billion. That's basically, it's off of $130 billion, something like that, in total farm income. And that drop is happening because, among other things, higher fuel and input costs. So even though you would think that farmers could put a lot of land into growing food to stop starvation with high prices, monopolistic business practices means that it sometimes isn't worth it for the farmer who is trying to figure out what to plant. And while I've talked about the US, these agribusiness giants are global, so the story isn't necessarily that different in other countries. Now, the final problem has to do with not what's on the farm, but getting that farm product to other countries. So it's shipping, the supply chain mess that we've been dealing with for the last few years. The big shipping firms who control the export and import trade don't think it's profitable enough to carry food from the US to other countries. It's so bad that steamship lines simply refuse to carry food. Boxes of agricultural commodities aren't moving, and that's angering farmers and food processors. Now, why wouldn't carriers want to bring US exports? I mean, that's what they do. That's what a carrier is. They move things, and they charge a fee for it. Well, this also has to do with consolidation. The ocean carrier industry is insanely concentrated, and just 3 carrier alliances manage 80% of global container ship capacity and 95% of the pivotal east-west trade lines. That's basically going from China to the west coast of the United States. Now, because of this consolidation, prices for carrying containers are extremely high, up to $15,000 to $20,000 per container, particularly on the lucrative route from China to the west coast of the United States. And that's because the value of what they're carrying is basically determines the price of the container, or of moving the container. So carrying electronics or other forms of high-value machinery from China to the US is quite profitable. But carrying bulk commodities from the US, bulk commodities like food, isn't actually, it's not that profitable. Exporting a box from the US full of grain is just $1,000, $500, something like that. Now, normally this wouldn't be that big a deal, right? I mean, if the price is different, who cares? You have to both import and export. If you take a box from China to the US and then you unload it, you want to take that box and load it full of something when you're carrying it back. And if you make less money carrying it back on the export side, it's not that big a deal. But the asymmetry is so big right now. It's so much more profitable to bring something from China to the US than these bulk commodities from the US to the rest of the world, that the time it takes to turn these ships around and move these containers out to the Midwest and load them full of grain, it's just not worth it to do it. So these carriers have been turning around immediately after dropping their cargo in Los Angeles, Long Beach. And they just take a bunch of empty boxes to get back to China as quick as possible so they can grab another load of electronics. And the net effect of this is that the US can't really export the food that we're growing. This is also actually true in Canada. It's basically an integrated market in the US and Canada. If there were a bunch of smaller steamship lines, you would assume that some of them would have expertise and they would differentiate themselves by being agricultural bulk commodities exporters, and they would use some of the smaller ports and maybe smaller ships to do that. And this is, in fact, what we used to have. We had different steamship lines that did different things. But now we basically just have 3 alliances, and they all want to do the same thing, which is bring electronics back from China. So this is actually a fundamental problem with the structure of the industry. It's also a problem with regulation, which I'm going to get to. Now, here's the good news. Policymakers are actually noticing the problem, and they are starting to act. And I would say actually these series of problems, not just one problem. The USDA, for instance, just put $250 million into grants for new fertilizer production. So they want to, one way of getting more competition is just to finance new competitors. And that is actually similar to what they did a few months ago, where they said we're going to provide grants for new meat packers to challenge the dominant meat packer oligopoly. They also put out a request, and this is where actually you come in if you want to help. The USDA put out a request for input from farmers or anyone else, public, on the consolidation problem. So the USDA said, tell us whether you think there's a problem with retail, with seeds, or with fertilizer. Now, anybody can comment. Doesn't matter who you are. You could be a farmer or not. Whatever you do, you could eat food. If you eat food, you can offer a comment. I've put a link to the USDA request in the description of this video, and you can just follow that, and there are instructions on how you can weigh in. So if you want to give the government some of your thoughts, you want to give the government a piece of your mind, you should go ahead and do that. Don't be shy. And on shipping, There's legislation in Congress that would actually fix this situation. It's called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. There's a couple of pieces. That's kind of the main one. And this law would mandate that carriers have to carry both imports and exports. It's already passed the House. It's sitting in the Senate. It'll probably move in some form or fashion. Everyone kind of knows that we have a really big problem with our supply chains. And so it's kind of like behind the scenes, not behind the scenes, but it's one of those bills that isn't a culture war soccer ball that people can kick around, but it's super important, and so no one's paid attention to it, but it is moving. Now, there are other like really obvious things to do. Like, for example, we could stop turning corn into ethanol, which is stupid, expensive, and it's wasteful. It's especially stupid right now when you can make a lot of money selling corn, right? Like ethanol is kind of a subsidy to farmers, particularly in Iowa, but they don't need the subsidy right now because they could just sell their corn. But more broadly, we actually need to look back at our food supply system and, kind of in total, and find ways of making sure that family farmers get reasonable prices for crops without having to deal with agribusiness monopolists interfering in the market and creating so much volatility. We need to make price signals actually mean something so that when prices go up, there's more land put under cultivation. Now, during the New Deal, we had such a system. So this was in kind of the 1930s to roughly the 1970s. Before that, we had a similar dynamic where the agricultural system wasn't particularly rational, and you had overproduction and underproduction, lots of waste of land. So in the New Deal, we created something called supply management. And supply management basically had the government manage swings in commodity prices and make sure that farmers could make a reasonable return by putting land under cultivation, but wouldn't overproduce and wouldn't actually, they would have incentives to make sure that they managed the land so it could continue to produce crops. And we can return to models that worked like that. We know how to do this. So to summarize, the global food supply problem, we're in a really dangerous position right now. And in the next year or two, we actually could have famine all over the world. Maybe political instability as well, certainly political instability if you have famine. Now, it's not going to happen in the US. We'll face higher prices, but elsewhere it could be really awful. And as we know, elsewhere often doesn't stay elsewhere for that long. But the thing is, none of this is inevitable. We don't have to let millions starve or see political instability due to food shortages. We don't have to see farmers go bankrupt when they could make a lot of money growing crops. We know how to fix this. We know how to prevent famines. We have reserves. We can also produce more food. And if we break up agricultural monopolies and make it profitable for farmers to grow crops, they will. If we make it possible to export more food, instead of sending ships full of empty containers that could otherwise be carrying grains, then that's what our ocean carriers are going to do. We'll export food. It's really addictive to imagine catastrophe. I see this a lot, right? There's going to be huge famines. And on the brink of what could be nuclear war with scenes of shelling and chaos all the time, it's easy to imagine catastrophe. And social media doesn't make it any better. It makes it a lot worse. It's polarizing. If it bleeds, it leads supersized times 1,000, right? Remember though, throughout history, things always seem to be falling apart, right? In the 50s, people were, little kids had to hide under desks and drills to see if there was going to be an atomic war. So it always kind of seems like things are falling off the edge. But, we always seem to be able to muddle through. In fact, often we're able to address problems before they become catastrophes. We're a fantastically wealthy country with magnificent technology and enormous state capacity. So we can address really bad situations like the one we're in today or the one the globe is in today. And that's what I think about the food situation. It's really dangerous. It's not looking good, but we don't have to panic. We should just use this moment to grow more food temporarily and more broadly, to look back and think about how to fix our food systems. If we do, then we won't have a famine over the next couple of years. And besides that, we'll have flourishing rural towns once again. If we don't, well, it could be like the Arab Spring, only this time it's not going to even be with the optimistic beginning. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, sign up for my market power focused newsletter, Big, which you can find below in the description of this video. Have a good one.
Hey guys, we're gonna be totally upfront with you. This is the most perilous time that we have ever operated in.
It is so difficult just to try to sort through the news, but even more importantly, to bring you accurate information as this wave of lockdown and censorship spreads across the nation.
Yeah, look, if you can become a premium subscriber today at breakingpoints.com, you're gonna help us build out a vibrant, independent media ecosystem which is free of mainstream pressure. We can't tell you how important that is at a time like this.
Yep, that's right. Go to breakingpoints.com to subscribe. We love you guys and we appreciate you so much.